Chapter 9, Writing Up Your Research. Now we're on page 129 of the book, Doing Developmental Research, A Practical Guide. And although this book has a focus on developmental sciences, these tips are relevant regardless of your research topic. So before you begin writing your research, you want to consider where you may submit your research paper. As we read this chapter, you might also refer to Chapter 10 on selecting the journal and establishing authorship. In this chapter, I provide several sections of a research paper that I co-authored and which was published in PLOS 1. Here I highlight some of the tips discussed in this book. Note that the formatting of this research paper in the book follows the general guidelines for the journal. You'll want to check in advance with the journal where you're submitting your research paper to obtain their own formatting requirements. It's also important to remember, as you conduct your research and read published papers, that just because something is published does not mean it is perfect. You might well end up going back one day to your published work and thinking, why did I write that way? Why did I present that graph in that particular way? Just remember that even if your work is published, there is always room for improvement. This paper is titled, and now we're on page 130, Young Infants' Neural Processing of Objects is Affected by Eye Gaze Direction and Emotional Expressions. We are not going to read the entire paper, but I'm just going to highlight a few of the notes for you. So we begin with the abstract on page 130. You might want to take some time now to review the abstract. On the note on page 131, we see that the first sentence of the abstract is broad and clear. The second sentence becomes more specific. The next sentence highlights why social signals are so important. The authors highlight a gap in the literature when they state, quote, "It has been a matter of debate." The new findings are also highlighted. So we're getting here, like, what's the question and what is new? And why is it so important? The final sentence highlights the relevance of the research for a variety of disciplines. We then move on to the introduction. And the first sentence is, social referencing is the ability to search for and use social signals in order to modulate behavior in a new or ambiguous situation. The note here states this is a broad and clear general sentence, and the introduction of a research paper is written like a funnel with the larger topic presented first. We then go on in the introduction and we're able to, we read the sentence, however, the developmental trajectory that leads to the efficient detection of relevant social signals in human adults has only been investigated in part. So here we're hinting at, the note here says, here we're highlighting an open question. We then go further into the paper where we see the sentence, these measures are highly difficult to apply with younger infants whose scope of action is limited. However, it's conceivable that infants' attention system can be affected by referential emotional signals even before they're able to respond at the behavioral level. And the note here says, we're suggesting a gap or an open area in the literature. We also, in the next section, highlight why this is so important. And on page 132, we see in bold, however, no study has investigated whether young infants' neural system is sensitive to another person's expression of fear toward an object. And then we go on further and we see the sentence, we directly investigated whether young infants' neural responses can be affected by an adult's fearful expression and eye gaze when directed at an unfamiliar object. So there we're getting at the what's new, as that says in the note. And then the next section says, we chose to test this very young age group because infants use eye gaze cues to facilitate learning. And so there's a rationale. So that's what the note says. We're giving a rationale for why are we testing that age. In the results section, we can see here through the note, it says ERP, event-related potential responses to an object in study 1 are presented in figure 1B. So we're explaining where the person should be looking for that information. Objects that had previously been gaze cued by an adult with a fearful expression elicited a substantially increased NC, a negative component, on the right frontocentral channels when compared with objects that had been looked at by a neutral face. So the note there is that the figures are clearly defined and described. They're clearly described. We then move on to the discussion where we read the sentence, infants allocated increased attention toward objects that were potentially dangerous, namely objects that have been gaze cued by an adult with a fearful expression. So the note here states that the new findings are clearly stated. Then we move on and it says, however, alternative explanations for these results should be taken into account. The note there states alternative explanations are highlighted. It's much better if you highlight these explanations, alternative explanations, rather than having a reviewer hint at those for you. And then we see the sentence, the current experiments are the first to demonstrate 3-month-old infant sensitivity to fearful expressions together with referential eye gaze. So there, we clearly see what is new about the findings. Again, the paper is there. There's also on page 144 a checklist, which is very important. So let's review not the entire checklist, but some sections. So there's one called overall. And in this section, it says, one, I checked the manuscript guidelines for the journal to which I plan to send my paper. So that's one of the first things you want to do. Then you want to read some papers in that journal. So it says, I read 2 to 3 papers that were previously published in the journal, which gave me a sense of the correct formatting and structure to use for my own paper. Editing. Again, we're on page 144 of Doing Developmental Research. I removed all unnecessary words and phrases from my manuscript. I carefully reread the manuscript at least 2 to 3 times, looking for typos and errors. I played devil's advocate, looking for errors, potential confounds, and logical gaps in my manuscript. I looked for ways to make transitions within the manuscript smooth and logical. This one is very important. I kept the terms of my paper as consistent as possible. And then I put the example there. I avoided writing that baby saw an object. And then baby saw the puppet. Baby saw the stimulus. Baby saw it. So there was just several examples. You want to be consistent. In this case, I would probably, assume that the baby was looking at a puppet, I would probably use the word puppet throughout. So always say, baby saw the puppet. You want to avoid using acronyms unnecessarily, and this is going to help the paper flow and the person reading it. So they don't have to go back and figure out what all of these acronyms mean every time they see these. Oh, this one is one of my favorites, that you read the paper aloud 2 or 3 times, which helped you to figure out if it flowed. That one is so important. You arranged to have a few non-experts read the paper and confirm that they understood it. You want your papers to be accessible to a broad audience. I had at least 2 native speakers read the paper and confirm that it was correct. And now you can also use AI to help you with that as well. You went through the paper and you ensured that you did not use words such as prove or feel that. Then we move on to the title page. You made the title as catchy as possible. You confirmed that the sentences in the manuscript were direct and concise. You made sure that the title of your paper reflected your original question and the findings. Then we move on to the introduction. You address what's the question, why is your study important, and what is new. And any reader can find and circle that in your paper. So anyone should be able to find in your introduction, what is the question and why is it important and what is new. The discussion, you highlighted some limitations. The references, you checked that the references cited in the manuscript were listed in the reference section. And then also you checked the reference section and make sure that those were actually cited in the manuscript. Now we're looking at figures on page 146. And here you included figure captions that were clear. You properly labeled the X and Y axes on your graph. You included standard error bars if required. You confirm that your graphs and figures corresponded to the data that you're presenting. You made sure that graphs were clear and easy to read. And you included figures and images to help the reader through the manuscript. And here I have a tip, and it says use figures to guide the reader. So helpful. As shown in figure 1, this is an example. So as shown in figure 1, children gazed significantly longer at the red box compared to the blue box. So that would be a helpful example. But not helpful would be, on average, children gaze at 8 seconds at the red box and 59 seconds at the green box, and then in parentheses, see figure 1. You see the difference? In the first example, we're sort of highlighting the figure and showing them where to look in the paper, and then explaining how they should be reading that figure. In the second example, see figure 1 is at the end. So their person is not even really directed to the figure, and it's like an afterthought in the parentheses. So look at that on page 146. And then there were a couple of other considerations. 1, I checked with all of my collaborators that they wished to be included as authors before I submitted the manuscript. I let my fellow authors know that I submitted the manuscript and kept them informed when reviews and comments arrived. And I asked my co-authors whether they wanted to be sent a copy of the submitted version of the manuscript. And the other thing you want to be able to do is to give your colleagues and collaborators enough time to make any edits before that manuscript is submitted. So if something, let's say, is due on March 15th, you don't want to write to your collaborators on the 14th and say, oh, do you have any corrections to make? You want to give people enough time. I would say 2 to 3 weeks is appropriate. All right, so there we are with chapter 9. We're on page 147 right now, and still in chapter 9. This is one of my favorite sections of the book, Doing Developmental Research. and it's called Dead Birds. Nobody likes a dead bird. This is a wonderful term coined by one of my colleagues and mentors. It refers to the, quote, dead papers that are proudly delivered to colleagues 6 months, 1, 2, or 3 years after we all know the results and after the paper was hot and interesting. It's like a cat that expects its master to be happy when it deposits a dead bird to his or her feet. You can avoid bringing your colleagues or mentors dead birds by writing your papers up quickly for publication and not losing momentum. Did you get a new job or just get into graduate school? Are you about to get married? Make it a point to submit your research papers beforehand, especially if collaborators or co-authors are involved. Once you get revisions back, follow through with your colleagues immediately. If you delay unduly, someone else may end up taking over your research project.